This is At Issue on MPB Think Radio. I'm Michael Guidry. Each week we have an in-depth conversation with a key player involved in the 2024 legislative session. This week we're joined by House Minority Leader Robert Johnson of Natchez. Welcome to At Issue, Representative Johnson.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Thank you. I'm going to start here. You were House Minority Leader during Speakership Philip Gunn. You're currently House Minority Leader under the new leadership of Speaker Jason White. It's what 7 weeks in. What's that change been like? This first kind of part of the session.
Well, it's been a little bit of more of the same and a little bit different.
Okay.
The little bit different has been the current speaker came in, and I think his intention is still the same, and that is to have more bipartisan work. And I can tell you that when Speaker Gunn first got elected, he did the same thing. I was chairman of transportation under Speaker Gunn and got a lot of things done for my community and for the whole state of Mississippi that hadn't been done before. Jason White, though, in terms of issues, he has told me, and he has presented himself as being less polarized on a number of issues.
Okay.
And the main one being Medicaid expansion, which is a big issue here. So I'm hopeful about that. Now, the part that has been kind of more of the same has been he promised to be a little bit more transparent. I haven't seen as much of that as I'd like. We've had two economic development bills that have kind of wasn't his fault, but shoved down our throats, so to speak. And somebody said, well, that's a good shove. Those are good things. Well, I don't think anything is good when you don't, as a legislator, you don't have the chance to actually vet a piece of legislation, talk about it, examine it. I voted for it, but I'm voting for it and I'm crossing my fingers and hoping that the things I have not had answered about those bills are okay. And then the most disappointing thing was what we did with the ballot initiative.
That was a surprise from what I saw on the floor.
It was an absolute surprise. Speaker White actually came to our caucus and talked to us. We had a really good exchange. And one of the things he actually said to us is that on initiative referendum, he said to us that I intend to come out with a clean bill. Well, it was anything but a clean bill. And I talked to him about it, and he said as much as he wanted to, there was just an overwhelming move in his own caucus to do it that way. It wasn't necessarily his preference, but he does lead the Republican caucus. So I would have rather seen him stand up and say, no, we're not doing it, but they did it. But that bill is still alive and a lot of work to be done. If it comes back, I hope we get a chance to fix it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to spend a large portion of the time on that bill, that ballot initiative bill, but watching that on the floor, the presentation and defense of the bill seemed a lot of, well, this is just what we have. This is what will get us moving forward to the Senate. And so, based on what you just said about being promised a clean bill and wanting to see a clean bill, does that part of the process create frustration?
Yeah, it does. It creates frustration because last year the Senate was the House that kept saying we need to put all these restrictions in the bill. We need to make sure we have more signatures. We need to make sure we have veto power, be able to overturn something we don't like. The House was the House that was the one that was saying, no, it doesn't need to be as restrictive. So for us to start out that way was disappointing. I anticipated getting a bill back from the Senate with that kind of foolishness in it. I didn't expect to send one to them. And so I'm just hoping that maybe now the Senate, and I heard the Senate has a change of heart. I've heard on different occasions, I've heard the Lieutenant Governor say he thinks it ought to be a clean bill, even though he seemed to agree that he was pro-life. I heard him on this program say, I'm pro-life,
right,
and so I don't have a problem with that part of it. But the Republicans in the House and the Senate say that they represent the people of the state of Mississippi, the majority of them, and that's why they have a supermajority. And if you believe that, then you shouldn't be afraid of any issue. You would expect that the people who elected you would carry an issue that you support in the House of Representatives.
And then one last thing on kind of this change, and you mentioned the conversation with the Lieutenant Governor on this program last week. What are you seeing, or are you seeing the same things he's seeing when it comes to a commitment to these joint hearings between House committees and Senate committees? And is it producing is it producing quality work, and is it making the process smoother in some regards? Like the
I
Lieutenant
think so.
Senator claims.
I have to admit, I think they are, and I'm glad to see more of that. We're seeing more of that this year than I've ever seen. I used to see it. We used to have them quite a bit about 20 years ago, but now we're back to doing them again. And I think what it does is it opens the process up to the public more. It gives a more intimate view about what the issues are, and it allows legislators, as opposed to trying to do everything on the floor, to ferret out some of these issues in these hearings. I'll give you a perfect example, even though it didn't manifest itself, in my opinion, in legislation, but mobile gaming. They had hearings all summer, and the few that I attended seemed to say, there are things that we need to do if we're going to have this to protect brick and mortar casinos. I don't think we did a very good job in the legislation that passed the House in doing that.
Okay.
But it still has to go to the Senate. So what came out of those hearings may manifest itself more out of what comes out of the Senate. But what I do know is that a lot of the information that I had, a lot of the information that other people had, and questions we had, I wouldn't have had those but for those joint hearings.
Okay. I want to get to some issues, but before we get there, I want to take this route just for a minute.
Okay.
We've talked a number of times over the years, going back to 2020, and the retirement of the 1894 flag, right?
Yeah, right.
I know that was something that you have sought for a long time,
right.
But it felt like it sort of took this national momentum following the death of George Floyd to really get any meaningful conversations down at the Capitol. And so, that's done. Since then, we've seen the legislature kind of him and haw. We had the critical race theory ban. There are other, I guess it's all kind of wrapped around this new iteration of wokeism, and the Republican Party taking that up as I guess as a cause.
Yeah.
I know you focus a lot on issues. We've talked about Robert E. Lee Day in conjunction with Martin Luther King Day and Confederate Memorial Day. We've had those conversations. So my question is what challenge do you encounter getting Republicans to have more of those conversations like you did about the flag? Because, I know those don't solve any real issues, but at the same time, they are representative of the state. And how do you get them to engage in those conversations?
Well, sometimes... Well, national pressure for sure happens. People ask me, why do you spend so much time talking, giving interviews with some of the national press? Because I want, we keep saying we want the state to grow. We want economic input from outside companies. And we want to look like we're a receptive state, that we've moved, sort of into the new century, so to speak. And so what you'd hope is that that criticism from outside of the state for things like turning out $38 million to feed hungry children in the summertime.
The summer EBT program, right?
Yeah, summer EBT program. Or there'd be some pressure to say, you have the worst health outcomes in the country. How long are you going to go and you don't provide the kind of health care that the government is offering you to support? What will happen with that? And I can see that happening with Medicaid expansion. I didn't see the pressure being brought to bear on the CRT and the diversity issues. Republicans and leadership in this state seem to revert back to, the political division, so to speak, and where they're going to wrap their arms around those kind of issues. But I think it takes public pressure. I said to someone this morning, one of the most frustrating parts of my service and what I'm trying to do is I can't get some of my fellow legislators to read enough and keep up to date on what the real issues are and to ferret them out. And even more frustrating is that the public doesn't do the in-depth reading where they can question like we need to. So people think, oh, you do a lot of talking, you like talking to. I said, no. My interest in making sure that I educate the public so they can raise these questions and they can ask. Okay. So I think that movement happens when more people understand what is happening at the Capitol, more people get involved. For instance, on these economic development issues, people are beginning to say to me, hey, I'm glad you brought that up. We do need to know how many real jobs are being created. We do need to know if we're giving $50 million to a Chinese company, what kind of company is it? And is it something, if it's supporting the Chinese government who may be involved in some human rights violations that we need? Those kind of things are things that people are beginning to pay attention to. So You're just trying to provide information as much as possible and hope there'll be some public pressure to bear.
And where those development projects are being prioritized, because I know that's been, for both of these big deals, that was something that came loudly from the minority caucus.
Yeah, I mean, and look, people say I'm not displeased that other people are getting jobs, but I cannot sit by, and some my colleagues and I can't sit by. We live west of I-55. There has been no major economic development project west of I-55 from the Tennessee line to Louisiana line in 30 years. That is, that's just unconscionable. We have the highest poverty rate, we have the highest unemployment rate, and we have the highest or the highest or the lowest doctor per patient ratio in the state. And all of that is driven by people moving out or people they can't stay anywhere where they don't have opportunity to have jobs. We love our part of the state. We love this state. And so to the extent that we can, we want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity. All our cities get a chance to grow. Instead of having a billboard in Greenville or Natchez say, look, we're creating jobs in Madison County, we'd like for those people to stay where they are.
Gotcha. The Republicans have them in supermajority, not just in your chamber, but the Senate also. So, I know that makes really pushing Democratic priorities a challenge.
Yeah.
Where are some of the places where you're seeing the most intersection with your Republican colleagues on issues that can get resolved and legislation that can get passed that appeases the policy priorities of both parties?
Healthcare and infrastructure. And I say those two things because I don't care if you're Democrat or Republican. I think there are four things that people inherently and really expect you to do as a government. They expect you to support and have adequate or better than adequate public safety. They expect you to do the same thing with public health, whether it be hospitals or health departments or providing opportunities for doctors to move into your area. Public education. They want good schools. They feel like that's the state's responsibility. And infrastructure, whether it be water and sewer, or highways or bridges and railway.
And now broadband.
And broadband. 40% of the state doesn't have broadband. They expect us to, those are things that only government can do. Somebody said, well, what about healthcare? I say healthcare is really, government is the only entity that really can provide it on a level that it needs to be provided. And that's, historically, I tell people, they say, well, why is it such a big deal? Why are hospitals suffering? When the Hill-Burton Act was passed and they created public hospitals, they didn't create public hospitals all over the country. They didn't do that because it was profitable. They did it because it was a public service. And so you don't have county hospitals that the federal government has consistently for the last 60 years provided funding for because they make money. They did it because they feel like every community, no matter how poor, how rural, you should have your own hospital. And so those are the kind of things that that people want us to do. Those are the kind of things that we're finding bipartisan support on. Now, you may not see publicly big locked arms, hurrah, let's get it together. But I can tell you on the floor of the House, we all are talking together about how we can do what we can do to solve these problems.
Okay. And so what are some of the solutions, especially to infrastructure? I mean, we've seen the lottery bill that's now a few years old. And I think every year except for its first year, or maybe the pandemic year, it's met that $80 million threshold for roads and bridges. What other solutions are there to address infrastructure? Because like you said, it's not just roads, it's water, it's sewage, it's broadband.
Yeah. Well, just on roads, we have a $300 million underfunding just for maintenance. 80 million sounds good, but we need about 220 million more. And quite frankly, the only way that we can do anything about that is to have a user fee, whether you call it gas tax or whatever you call it. That's how you pay for roads. That's how we've always paid for them. The problem is the index for gas prices for road construction hasn't been raised up in 25 years. No. And so unless we do something about that, we're still going to be underfunding and not getting roads. 28 to 29% of our roads and bridges in this state are either impassable or unsafe. and that's just not. It's especially problematic in a state that doesn't have a large mass transit system of any kind. So you got to have a way for people to go back and forth to work, kids to get back and forth to school, commerce to move. So we got to do those things. And so the solution is we got to come up with a funding mechanism. And if we can't do it with a gas tax, we got to do it with something. So we got to do something about that. And all of the, people talk about everybody, the big focus has been on the Jackson water and sewer issues. It's our largest city. But the truth is every town, county in this state just about has 100 or 120-year-old pipes that they're running water and sewer through. We just have to have a big, push to get that done, which when we think about it, we have a big surplus. We got one-time money. We could do quite a bit of that with some of this ARPA and a surplus one-time money that we have. And we really should. And I hope we will continue to have discussions about what we can do to get that done.
And the Lieutenant Governor has talked about that matching program that they did with a lot of those ARPA funds. I mean, is that something you're on board with? Do you think that's a fair mechanism?
I don't think that's a fair mechanism because, I understand the concept. I understand, and I like the idea that he feels like there ought to be some individual responsibility on the part of these municipalities and counties. But the truth of the matter is that there are counties and cities in this state who, whatever money that has come through the federal government that they've got direct funding for, they've already spent. And they didn't waste it, they used it to make things happen. And so we ought to continue to support them whether they have the matching money or not. There are communities, there are cities that are rich enough and affluent enough that they could have the money to do that. That's fine. They probably don't need the state money. But in small towns like Fayette, Mississippi, or Port Gibson, where they say, well, I don't have any money to match it with, we still need those roads done. We need those bridges fixed. We ought to do all we can to help them.
You brought up Port Gibson. Nearby is Lorman.
Yes.
We know through some federal reporting now that late land grant HBCUs have been underfunded by the states.
Yeah.
Is there a mechanism in place? Is there conversations in place to address that legislatively?
One of my colleagues, Jeffrey Harners, and I signed on to the bill with him, has introduced legislation to have direct appropriation given to Alcorn for that sum, since they've been underfunded to that degree. And all I can tell you is that we're having conversations. We don't know how far that's going to go. The state has never been very interested or seemed to be very energetic about the idea of just, okay, you were wrong, write the check. They haven't done that. We hope in this instance they feel some reasonableness and some willingness to do at least, let's get started with a partial payment and a promise to pay over time if you don't want to write a check directly right now. But we should definitely do something. I mean, we're speaking about Alcorn land grant colleges, but if you look at the history of appropriations and funding of universities in this state, the historically black colleges and universities have been grossly underfunded but compared to the major universities. And that disparity needs to be erased as much as possible.
And then staying in the vein of education, there is, at least from the perspective of conservative policy think tanks, a push for an expansion of the scholarship account. And kind of really opening up full school choice. There's a case that the Supreme Court is considering right now. Oral arguments were last week regarding how appropriations from the legislature can go to public or private schools. What is the position as minority leader? What's the position in the House with the House Democrats when it comes to education funding? What is and isn't copacetic to you?
Well, what's not copacetic is using public money to fund private schools. And my perspective is probably a little bit different. Well, maybe not so different. I mean, I grew up in an era, I was bused in 1968 to a school to integrate the school. And the integration, and their best effort at that time was to put all the black kids on the bottom floor and all the white kids on the top floor. That's what they called it. But it also saw a proliferation of private schools erected for the sole purpose of, maintaining segregation. And so I've never had. I don't begrudge anybody. My children went to private school for at least half of their education, and we paid for that. But public schools were built because there was too many kids in this country. The public education program was established. Too many kids in the country, and especially in the state of Mississippi, who were not getting an education. So the government provided that because they wanted to make sure that no matter where a kid lived, no matter where a child was, that we provide the resources for you to have a education. No matter how poor you were, how rich you were, you got treated the same way in the classroom. I don't think that needs to change, and it will change if you start giving public money to private schools instead of taking the money you need to take and fully fund schools that need the help. Without even talking about MAEP, let's just talk about, it's not hard to figure out what schools don't have, what school systems don't have the ad valorem base, the tax base, to fund schools at a level that will make sure that the children are getting all the things that a facility should offer. And so once we identify who those programs are, what their needs are, and meet them, and let me tell you something: anybody that tells you that those needs can be met with anything but money is just not telling the truth. So we can't afford to take that money and give it to somebody else until we fix the schools that need our help. And so I don't believe that we ought to take that and enlarge the scholarship program now. Short of giving money to fix those problems, there are concepts like community schools and those kind of things that we ought to look at to see how we can improve. Community schools just means getting more people in the community involved, helping fund that kind of a process where teachers won't have to buy all the paper towel and cleaning equipment and those kind of things. It just brings everybody, businesses, community, parents, teachers, friends, partners, all involved in creating an environment that you have a great school. We can do more of that. But short of that, we need to make sure that we address the funding inadequacies across the state before we start talking about, well, they're in a bad school district, we just give them the money, they can go to another school district. It's still up to that other school district to say whether or not they're going to accept the child. And they will pick and choose who they want. Right, just like right now, there are a lot of public school children that are going to private schools, but they're going to athletic scholarships, and that you'll see a lot of that. Instead of that athletic scholarship being funded by the school, they'll take state money and bring these athletes and take them away from public schools. So we shouldn't do that.
Real quick, we're I think 10 years now into the early learning collaboratives. What's your assessment of that?
I think they're good programs, but I think we should have a closer look at the numbers. I don't know if it applies to the early learning collaboratives, but one of the things that, the governor talks about how scores have improved and more graduation, but nobody talks about how many kids are repeating the grade. One of the things about third grade reading is that, if you don't pass the test, you got to go back and do it again. So some of those numbers are skewed by the fact that some of these kids are repeating the grade and coming and doing it again. But as a concept, the collaborative and all those things, I think are important and they work. We just need to, another point, we have more joint hearings to talk about what's actually happening and what are the outcomes and how we can improve on them.
All right. Another real quick one, taxes. We've talked before. Governor is still pushing for an elimination of the income tax. We've heard from some members of your party who say if anything gets cut, let's cut the grocery tax. Where are you? I know we've talked before how you said we're really not in the position to really be cutting anything. You still stand by that?
My position hasn't changed. My position hasn't changed. I was just in Natchez dealing with a young man who has a mental health issue. We can't find a place for him to go. And when I talk to the legislature about the fact that we need to put more money into mental health, we need to have more facilities, more experts, more professionals. Everybody tells us we just don't have enough money. Well, if we don't have enough money to address a very dire need in this state, we certainly don't have enough money to cut taxes. We have just too many needs. We just finished talking about the infrastructure needs. Nobody wants to raise the gas tax, but you're talking about cutting another tax? I tell some of my colleagues, grocery tax. Look, I probably spend, $300 or $400, at least $500 a month on groceries. If you cut the grocery tax, it may save me $50. It just won't. But most people don't spend that much money. I'm eating really well. And so, that it just doesn't do as much good. But it makes all the difference in the world if you got better roads and bridges and you got better schools and you have better health facilities. You can attract more industry. You can create more jobs. People make more money. They pour more money into the economy. Let's do that. And then we can talk about it. When we get to a point where we're so prosperous that everybody's doing so well, all our hospitals, all our schools, all our roads and bridges, our retirement system right now, not to digress,
It's in bad shape.
it's in bad shape. And they've already told us they're going to need at least, for the next 20 to 25 years, at least $300 million from the state government to pour into retirement. We've just passed an income tax a couple of years ago at $500 million a year that is costing the state. Fine. Nobody yet has come and say, thank you for this $80 or $90 a year or $100 I'm getting back in my pocket. Nobody said that. But they still complain about their roads and bridges, their hospitals, and their schools. So how do we afford how can we maintain a good retirement system, which we've had for quite some time? It's going to take us putting some money in and cut taxes at the same time. We just don't have room. Let's build. Let's provide services. People have never come to me and said, you need to let me keep more of my money from my taxes. I don't know who's saying that, but I get complaints about roads, bridges, schools, and facilities. People just want to have a community where all the things they expect government to provide, they are providing them in an adequate and professional way.
And the last thing I have is kind of bring everything full circle. It's been reported that the speaker has tapped some members to write a bill, file a bill that addresses the state's disenfranchisement clause in the Constitution, and the AG's opinion that expanded that to 22 felonies. That provision is currently also in the court right now. The Fifth Circuit took it up last month, and so kind of like I said, bringing it back full circle. When it comes to something like addressing disenfranchisement in Mississippi, and considering the whole reason it was written into code, how important are those transparency pieces when it comes to working with you and House Democrats on drafting a bill that is going to affect the lives of convicted felons who are released for crimes that, if you look at the list, some might say that penance is done?
Well, I'm 100% in favor of that. If you serve your time, you've paid your penance, you should be able to have your rights restored. We've been offering legislation to that effect for 20 or 25 years. And so I'm glad to hear that the Speaker and the rest of the Republicans are on board with that issue. And I think it's driven by the fact that this past election, even though the Republicans and Tate Reeves won the gubernatorial election, the turnout was low on both sides. I think we're seeing fewer and fewer people participate in the process. And so we ought to do all we can to involve more people in the voting process. And if that means restoring people's right to vote, no matter what crime, expanding the list of crimes, that's great. But the other thing Republicans are talking about that they've never wanted to talk about, they're actually talking about early voting. And so the idea of having early voting, that makes all the sense in the world as well.
No excuse absentee voting?
No excuse absentee voting. They actually, I don't know if we will pass it, but we've never been able to have a real conversation about it. So that's happening too. The idea is that this country is built on this electorate. If people don't participate in the electoral process by choosing leaders, having a voice on issues, then we can't survive as a government, we can't survive as a nation unless we have people voting and participating in the process. And so retarding that process makes no sense. Expanding that process means we are doing something about the future of our country.
And, going back to I do want to kind of hit back on that transparency piece. Do you expect to be in those conversations? Are you in those conversations, and how will you respond if this legislation is presented the same way the ballot initiative legislation was presented?
Well, unlike the ballot initiative legislation, we are involved in that conversation. Either myself or people in my caucus, we have people who have always championed that issue maybe a little bit more than I have. And so they're helping me, and we're all working together, and they're taking leadership on that issue. But I've been told, and it's been confirmed, that they're involved in it. They've even taken our legislation and incorporated it in their legislation. So we're constantly having discussions. Even somebody like Price Wallace, who I haven't had a real discussion with since his first year here about issues that I care about, we are all talking, and that's a great sign.
All right. Well, Representative Robert Johnson, House Minority Leader, thank you for taking some time to join us on that issue this week.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
All right.